Fire first. Always fire first in the dream. It ran along the porch rail like something alive and hungry, and the boy watched it from the tree line with his bare feet going numb in the frost. Smoke came up thick and orange lit. A horse screamed somewhere behind the barn. A man's voice, his father's voice, shouting a name that was not the boy's name, shouting it into the burning dark as if a name could put out a fire. 3 riders. No faces, only shapes cut black against the flame. Only the long guns caught in the light. A single shot. The shouting stopped. The boy did not remember deciding to run. He remembered only the cold closing over him like water, the ridge fallen away under his boots, the sound of the fire behind him going smaller and smaller until it was only a smear of orange low on the black hills, and then not even that. He remembered a latch. A door on the old grain shed down along the creek, latched from the outside, though no one should have had reason to latch it. He remembered pressing his face to the crack in the boards and watching the light of the burning house go out. Not all at once, but slow, the way a coal goes out, holding its color long after it has stopped being anything. He was 8 years old, and he did not go back. 21 years later, a man with the same eyes and none of the boy's name left in his mouth stood at the edge of another cold place, in another territory, and told himself the same lie he had told himself every winter since, that the fire had been an accident, that the door had latched itself, that a boy who runs from the sound of his father's voice being cut off mid-word is not the reason his father died, only a witness to it, and witnesses are not required to carry the weight of what they saw. He had gotten better at believing it in daylight, never at night, never in weather like this. The storm found him on the road 2 days out from anywhere, in high country he did not know, in territory whose name he had not bothered to learn before crossing into it, because names had stopped mattering to a man who did not intend to be found by anyone who might remember his own. He had traded his coat 3 towns back for a meal and a night indoors, and told himself he would find another before the cold turned serious. The cold turned serious in the mountains faster than a man's plans could keep pace with it. By the second night, the wind had teeth, and by the second morning his hands would not close around the reins of the horse he no longer had, because the horse had gone lame, and he had let it go rather than ride it lame, which was either mercy or foolishness, and by then he had stopped being able to tell the difference. He walked because walking was the only thing left to do. The land here ran high and open, snow already down on the ridge lines, though autumn had not fully let go of the lower valleys, a country caught between 2 seasons, the way he had spent 20 years caught between 2 names. Somewhere below him, a river was still running black and fast in its channel, not yet locked in ice, and its sound was the only sound in the world besides his own boots and his own breath, both of them going ragged now, both of them slower than they had been an hour before. He did not remember falling. He remembered the sky, very white, very close, and then the sound of something enormous moving toward him through the snow, a shape too large to be a man and too upright to be an animal, and he had one clear thought before the white closed all the way over him, and it was not fear. It was something closer to relief. If this was the end of it, he thought, at least it would be quiet. At least there would be no fire in it. He did not yet know that the woman walking toward him through the drifts had buried her own dead in this same white silence, twice, and had learned to listen for exactly this sound. A man's weight going down wrong in snow that was too deep and too cold to argue with. He did not yet know her name, or that she had not said more than a dozen words to another living soul in 11 days, or that the last stranger to come up her road with nothing but the clothes on his back had come to take something from her, not to give her something to carry. He did not know any of that. He only knew the cold, and then the not cold, which was worse, the particular deep quiet of a body deciding it had done enough fighting, and then a hand, closing around his collar with a strength that did not belong to the size of hand he expected, hauling him up out of the drift the way a man might haul a sack of grain, without ceremony, without asking permission, because permission was a thing you could afford to request only when you had time to spare, and out here, in this weather, at this hour, with the light already starting to fail along the ridges, there was no time to spare at all. The last thing he heard, before the dark took the rest of it, was a voice. Low, unhurried despite everything, a woman's voice, roughened by cold and disuse, speaking not to him but to herself, the way a person talks to steady their own hands. Not today, it said. Not on my ground, you don't. He held on to that sentence the way a drowning man holds on to a plank. He did not know yet what it would cost her to mean it. He did not know yet that meaning it would nearly cost her everything she had left. All he knew, falling into a dark that did not feel like dying anymore, was that somebody had decided, without knowing his name or his history, or the fire he carried behind his ribs like a second heart, that he was not allowed to stop here. It was, though he would not understand this for some time, the first decision anyone had made on his behalf in 21 years that was not designed to profit from him, protect itself from him, or erase him. He would spend the rest of the story learning what to do with that. Silas was not much of a town, and it had never pretended otherwise. A general store, a chapel with a bell too big for its steeple, a livery, a saloon that did double duty as the only place in 40 miles to hear news less than a month old, and beyond the last of the buildings, the land opening out into high pasture and timber and rock, running all the way to the Bittern Range where the snow never fully left even in July. It was the kind of place that measured a person the way it measured cattle, by what they could carry and what they cost to keep, and by that measure there was no one in the territory it had settled its judgment on more thoroughly or more unfairly than Marta Vane. She stood a full head over any man in the county, and most of 2 heads over the smaller ones, built long through the shoulder and the forearm the way her father had been, a woman whose hands could close a fence post into the ground with 3 blows where another man needed 6, whose back had carried more grain sacks and more grief than anyone in Silas cared to count. She had buried her mother at 19 and her father at 26, and in between and after she had kept the homestead running on Coldwater Creek with the stubbornness the town called unnatural when it was feeling generous and called worse when it was not. They were not cruel to her exactly. Cruelty would have required more attention than they gave her. It was smaller than cruelty, and in its way harder to fight, because it did not announce itself. It was the way conversation thinned when she came into the store. It was the mothers who found a reason to steer their children's eyes elsewhere on the road, not from unkindness so much as habit, the same habit that made a person look away from anything too large to be comfortable, a boulder in a field, a storm on the horizon. It was the fact that in 11 years no one had asked her to a dance, though every other woman in Silas under 40 had been asked at least once, and the fact that she had stopped noticing the absence somewhere around year 7, or told herself she had, which was not quite the same thing. She rose before light and worked until after it, because the land did not care what the town thought of her, and the land was the only thing left that spoke to her in a language she trusted. She fed the stock. She split wood enough for 2 households, though there was only ever the one. She mended what broke with her own 2 hands because paying someone else to mend it meant asking someone else to come stand on her ground and look at her the way they looked at her, and she had learned to prefer her own company to that particular arithmetic. There was a chair on the porch that had been her father's, and she did not sit in it, not because it grieved her to, but because sitting suggested there was a moment in the day with nothing left to be done, and she had arranged her life so that no such moment ever arrived. Work was not a punishment to her. It was closer to a language, the only one she had never been made to feel too large for. At night, in the low light of a single lamp, she kept a ledger. Not of money, though there was a ledger for that too, thin as it was. This one was smaller, older, its cover soft with handling, and in it she wrote nothing but weather. The frost dates, the first snow, the day the creek locked over and the day it broke again in spring. Her father had kept it before her, and his father before him. 3 generations of Vanes measuring their lives against a mountain that did not know or care that they were measuring anything at all, and there was a comfort in that indifference she had never been able to explain to anyone, because no one had ever stayed long enough near her to ask. She did not think of herself as lonely. Loneliness was a word for people who expected company and did not have it. She had stopped expecting a long time ago, and what was left after the expecting stopped was not loneliness so much as a very wide, very quiet room, and she had furnished it as best she could with work and weather and the sound of her own boots on frozen ground. That was the shape of her life on the morning the storm came down out of the Bittern Range 3 days early, and without the courtesy of warning anyone in Silas it was coming. She did not yet know that somewhere out on the high road above the creek, a man was walking into that same storm with no coat and no horse and no name. He was willing to give anyone carrying a fire behind his ribs. He had been trying to outwalk for 21 years. She only knew that the sky had gone the wrong color too early in the day, a green-gray she had seen only twice before in her life, both times before storms that killed something. She brought the stock in early. She banked the fire high. She told herself, the way she told herself every year at this time, that she was simply being careful, and not that some old animal part of her was listening for something the weather had not yet decided to bring her. She did not know yet that it was already on its way, stumbling and half-frozen up the last mile of road toward her gate, carrying inside it a debt to the past that had nothing to do with her, and would, before the year was out, cost her almost everything she had left to lose. The first person to speak the stranger's presence into being was not Marta at all, but Hetty Odell, who kept the general store in Silas and kept, alongside it, a ledger of gossip far more thorough than any account book, updated daily and shared freely with anyone who lingered near the flour barrels long enough to be considered an audience. Ansel says he saw a man on the high road 2 days back, she told the room at large, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, the way she told most things. No coat on him. Middle of that green sky, no coat, walking north like the devil himself had business waiting. Ansel hollered at him to come in out of it, and the man just kept on, like he hadn't heard a word or didn't care to. Probably nothing left of him by now, said the man at the counter, not unkindly, the way people speak of weather deaths in country where they're common enough to have lost their sting. That storm come down mean. Probably, Hetty agreed, and went on measuring out coffee because there was nothing to be done about a stranger who would not stop for shelter, and the territory was full of men who walked into weather they had no business walking into and were never spoken of again. It was, in Silas, close to an ordinary kind of tragedy, filed away with drought years and lightning-struck barns, sad but not strange. It might have ended there, a rumor with no second act, if old Ansel Pruitt himself had not come in an hour later with something more than a story. Ansel farmed the parcel between the Odell place and the base of the Vane Road, a quiet man of perhaps 60 who had outlived 2 wives and both his sons, and had, in the years since, developed the habit of paying close attention to things other people walked past without seeing. He set his hat on the counter and said, without preamble, that he'd gone out at first light to check his fence line along the road on account of the storm, and had found a set of boot tracks heading north that stopped being 2 sets of boot tracks and 1 drag mark, and then stopped being any tracks at all a 1/4 mile short of the Vane gate. Snow'd have covered him by now if he went down out there, Ansel said, unless somebody found him first. There was a silence in the store that had a particular shape to it, the shape silence takes when several people are thinking the same name and none of them wants to be the one to say it first, because saying it first means admitting you thought of her at all. It was Hetty, in the end, who said it, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a woman stating a fact of geography. Well, if anybody found him and got him in out of that, it'd be Marta Vane. Wouldn't be another soul out that road in weather like we had. Nobody answered her. Nobody needed to. It was true, and it was said the way people said true things about Marta, as a fact rather than a kindness, the way a person might note that a mountain was tall or a well was deep, an observation about a force of nature rather than a woman. But there was something else moving under the flat surface of that silence, something none of them would have named out loud if pressed, and it was this, a small, uneasy curiosity about what it might mean if it turned out to be true. A stranger, alive because of her. A debt owed to the one household in the territory nobody in Silas had ever thought to owe anything to. Etta Odell, Hetty's youngest, 9 years old and entirely unburdened by the town's careful habits of not looking, spoke up from where she'd been sorting buttons by the window, unasked, the way children do. "I hope she did find him," Etta said. "I hope she gets to keep him." Etta. Her mother's voice carried the particular weariness of a parent correcting a child for saying, too plainly, a thing the adults in the room had been carefully not saying at all. "Well, I do," Etta said, entirely unrepentant, and went back to her buttons, and nobody in the store contradicted her again, though several of them looked for just a moment uncomfortable in a way they could not have explained. Outside, the storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a hard blue sky and a silence over the white hills that felt, to anyone standing in it, less like peace than like a held breath. Somewhere up the Vane Road, past the last of Ansel's fence line, past the place where 2 sets of tracks had become 1 drag mark and then nothing, smoke was rising thin and steady from a chimney that had not, until 2 nights ago, had any reason to burn its fire quite so hot, quite so long into the daylight hours. No one in Silas could see that smoke from where they stood, but it was there all the same, a small gray thread against the blue, marking the exact point where a story that would eventually unravel half the territory's careful arrangements had already, quietly, without permission from anyone, begun. He came back to himself slowly, the way a man surfaces through deep water, aware of warmth before he was aware of anything else, aware of the ache in his hands and feet before he was aware of his own name, and aware, before either of those things, of the smell of wood smoke and something cooking low and slow, a smell that belonged to a kitchen, to a house, to a life he had not let himself imagine belonging to in a very long time. He opened his eyes to a low ceiling of hewn beams and a single window gone blue-white with reflected snow, and for a moment he did not move, because moving seemed like it might undo whatever miracle had put a roof over him instead of 6 feet of drift. "You're awake, then." The voice came from across the room, low and unhurried, the same voice he had carried down into the dark with him. And when he turned his head, he found the woman who owned it, standing at a black iron stove with her back half to him, tending something in a pot with the economy of motion of someone who had performed the same task 10,000 times before and did not need to look at her hands to do it. She was, he understood even before he had fully gathered his senses, the largest woman he had ever seen, and one of the largest people, taller than he was by some margin, and built with the solidity that made the small cabin seem, briefly, like a dollhouse arranged around her rather than a house she happened to live in. It was not the first thing he noticed about her for very long, though, because the second thing he noticed, almost in the same breath, was that she had not turned fully around to look at him, and he understood without being told that this was deliberate, a courtesy extended to a stranger too weak to defend himself against being stared at. "How long?" he managed, and his voice came out as little more than a scrape. 2 days. She said it without inflection, a fact and nothing more. "You had the cold sickness bad, talked some, out of your head, didn't say much that made sense." A pause, ladling something into a bowl. "Didn't say your name either, not once. Man usually says his own name first, out of his head or not." "You didn't." He said nothing to that because there was nothing safe to say, and she did not press him, which he would come to understand over the following days was entirely in character for her. She set the bowl down on a stool beside the low bed she had made for him near the fire, still without quite looking at him directly, and said only, "Eat what you can hold. There's more." The broth was plain, salted, made from something she had clearly not had much of to spare, and he understood, eating it, that he was consuming days of her careful rationing in a single sitting, and that she had not once, in 2 days of a stranger's fever and a stranger's incoherent talking, considered turning him back out into the cold to conserve it. "I'm obliged," he said finally, which was thin and inadequate and the only true thing he had. "More than I know how to say." "Don't need it said." She had turned by then, and for the first time he saw her face straight on, broad, weathered, plain in the way of a face that had never been taught to arrange itself for anyone's approval, and eyes that were doing something careful and guarded, even as the rest of her moved through the room with total confidence. You'd have done the same for a dog caught out in it. Wasn't a hard choice. He wanted to tell her it was not the same, that a dog did not carry 21 years of running behind its ribs, that a dog had not let a man die under a burning porch rail without lifting a hand to stop it. He said none of that. He said only, "Still, I'm obliged." She studied him a moment longer than the exchange strictly required, the way a person studies a fence post to judge whether it will hold weight, and something in her expression suggested she had decided, provisionally, that it might. "You got a name you're willing to part with, or should I keep calling you the stranger in the bed? Like you're a ghost I'm boarding." He hesitated. It was the first hesitation he allowed himself to notice in her presence, and he saw, in the small flicker of her eyes, that she had noticed it too, and had decided, with the same economy she brought to everything else, not to push on the bruise she had just found. "Silas," he said finally. It was not a lie. It had simply not been the whole of a name in a very long time, and he found, offering it to her, that the half-truth cost him more than he expected, sitting there in her borrowed warmth with her broth still warm in his hands. "Silas." She said it back once, testing its weight the way she might test a length of rope, and seemed satisfied it would hold. Marta Vane, this is my ground you're on, and that was my father's bed you near died in, so you'll forgive me if I don't stand on much ceremony about it. No ceremony needed. He managed, for the first time and longer than he could easily account for, something close to a real smile, small and tired though it was. Wouldn't know what to do with it if you offered. Something in her face shifted at that, not quite a smile answering his, but close enough to its neighborhood that he felt absurdly like a man who has been handed something valuable without quite understanding what he did to earn it. He did not yet know that she had not smiled, even that little, at another living soul since the last frost of the previous winter. He only knew that the fire behind his ribs, banked low for 2 days by fever, and now stirring back to life with his return in strength, had gone, for the length of that small exchange, almost quiet. It would not stay quiet. He knew that, too, even then. But for one afternoon, in a stranger's borrowed bed, with a bowl of thin broth going cold in his hands, he let himself have the quiet anyway. Trust, in that house, was not built the way it was built elsewhere, with words traded across a table until 2 people had said enough of them to feel they knew each other. It was built the way Marta built everything, brick by brick, chore by chore, in the small, unremarked labor of 2 people learning where the other one's hands wanted to go. He was too weak to work for the first week, and it chafed at him worse than the cold sickness had, lying by the fire while she split wood and hauled water and fed stock through a yard still deep in drift, until finally, on the 8th day, he got himself up against her flat instruction not to, and found the second axe in the shed and split kindling until his unaccustomed hands blistered and split too. She found him at it when she came back from the barn, and he braced for her anger, and got instead a long look at his ruined palms, and a short nod, and a jar of salve set on the porch rail without a word, which he understood, correctly, to be the closest thing to approval she was willing to spend on him yet. After that, the work became the language between them, because neither of them had much practice in any other kind. He learned the rhythm of her days, and the stock fed before light, the wood split before the cold set in for the evening, the ledger of weather written by lamplight after the supper dishes were done. And he folded himself into that rhythm the way a man learns the current of a river he intends to swim in for a while, carefully, respectfully, aware that the river had been running long before he arrived and would keep running long after. She asked him no more about his past than his single half-name, and he offered her no more than that. And for a time this arrangement suited them both. 2 people who had each, in their own way, learned that the past was safer left uninterrogated. But small truths leaked out anyway, the way they do between 2 people sharing close quarters and long silences. She learned he could read, and read well, from the careful way he handled the 2 books she owned. He learned she had taught herself figures from her father's account books after he died, working out the debts and the seed costs by lamplight, with a determination that had kept the homestead solvent through 3 lean years running. She learned he flinched badly at the sound of a gunshot, even distant, even a hunter's rifle 3 ridges over, and did not ask him why, though she noted it the way she noted weather. He learned that she did not sit in the chair on the porch, and one evening, without thinking too hard about why it mattered to him, he sat in it himself and waited to see what she would do. She stood in the doorway a long moment, looking at him sitting in her father's chair with the last of the light going copper over the western ridge, and something crossed her face that he could not fully read, grief and something gentler than grief moving through it together. Then she came and sat on the porch step below the chair instead of turning him out of it, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them had, for the first time, nothing uneasy in it. "He used to whittle, evenings," she said finally, nodding at nothing, at the chair, at the memory of a man who was not there. "Never made anything useful, little animals mostly, gave most of them away to whichever kid was small enough to still want a wooden fox. You keep any?" "One." She was quiet a moment. "A wolf, poorly made, one ear's bigger than the other. He was better with fence posts than knives." A ghost of that almost smile again. "I keep it on the sill. Don't rightly know why." He thought, hearing that, of a small carved wolf worn smooth by 21 years of a boy's, then a man's, thumb working over it in his pocket, the only object that had survived the fire with him because it had been in his hand when he ran, and he had simply never let go. He said nothing about it. But that night, alone by the banked coals after she had gone to her own room, he took it from his pocket and looked at it a long time, turning it over in the firelight, and set it back against his chest instead of returning it to the dark of his coat, as though it wanted, suddenly, to be nearer the surface of him than it had been allowed to be in a long time. The first joke passed between them on a morning 3 weeks into his recovery, over nothing more than a bucket he had set down in the wrong place, and she had walked directly into in the dark. She did not shout. She stood there a moment with the bucket rolling away across the frozen yard and said, with a dryness he had not yet heard from her, "You've been here 3 weeks and already rearranging my ground. Careful, Silas. Man starts moving buckets. Next thing you know, he's got opinions about the fence line." He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, surprised bark of a sound he had not made in longer than he wanted to calculate. And she looked for a moment, almost startled by the sound of it, as though she had forgotten it was a thing her house could still produce. "I'll leave the fence line to you," he said. "I've got opinions enough of my own to manage." "That's so." She picked up the bucket herself, unhurried, and did not quite look at him as she said it, but something in her voice had gone warmer by a full degree. "Well, keep them to yourself a while yet. I'm not partial to a man's opinions till I know if his judgment's any good." It was, he understood, walking back toward the barn in the thin morning light, the closest thing to an invitation she had offered him yet. Not to stay, not exactly, but to keep proving himself worth the asking. He did not yet know how little time the two of them had left to build on that small, fragile beginning. Before the past he had carried up her road in his pocket came looking for him in earnest, and brought her whole life down with it when it arrived. He only knew, walking back with the empty bucket swinging light in his hand, that for the first time in 21 years he wanted very badly to still be standing somewhere, in some particular place, when the reckoning came. It was Marta's idea to go into Silas, not his. The salt was low, and the coffee gone entirely, and she had never in her life let a man's presence in her house change the shape of her errands, and she said as much when he offered carefully to stay behind and mind the stock instead of riding in with her. "You'll come or you won't," she said, saddling the mule with her usual economy of motion. "But I'm not asking your permission to go to my own town for my own coffee." He came. He told himself it was because 6 weeks of her hospitality had earned her at least the company on a cold ride, and did not examine too closely the smaller, truer reason underneath it, which was that he did not want to be parted from her for even half a day, a wanting he had not felt toward another person in longer than he could easily measure. Solace announced itself the way small towns always did, as a scatter of roof lines against the white hills, and then, closing distance, as a street full of eyes. He felt them before he saw them, the way a man learns to feel a gun trained on his back. Conversation on the boardwalk thinned as the mule cart came into the wide street. The particular thinning Marta had long since stopped noticing, and he, new to it, noticed with total clarity. A woman drew her child a half-step closer at the general store's door. Two men at the livery stopped talking and did not start again until the cart had passed. It was not open hostility. It was smaller than that and colder, the kind of collective withholding a town can practice on a person it has decided, without ever quite saying so aloud, does not belong to its ordinary category of citizen. He looked at Marta and found her face arranged in the particular flatness he had come to recognize over 6 weeks as her armor, chin level, eyes forward, giving the street nothing to feed on. He understood, watching her, that she had built that flatness over 11 long years, one dismissive glance at a time, and that she wore it now the way another woman might wear a good coat against weather, out of necessity rather than choice. Something in him, watching it, went very quiet and very hard. They had barely tied up outside the general store when the crowd, for it became quickly something close to a crowd, curiosity outweighing the town's usual reserve, arranged itself into position, the way a crowd does when it senses a spectacle it has been half expecting for weeks. The stranger who had walked into a killing storm and not died, big Marta Vane's boarder, 3 weeks now, going on a month, and no one able to say for certain what manner of arrangement that made them, and every one of them wanting, badly, to be the first to see his face and decide. He felt the weight of that collective decision-making settle onto him like a hand at his collar, and he understood, standing there under it, exactly what she had been living under for 11 years without a single day's relief. He did not flinch. It cost him something to manage it, an old habit of making himself smaller under scrutiny, fighting hard against the new, unfamiliar instinct to stand his full height instead. But he managed it, and when Hetty Odell came to the door of her own store with undisguised curiosity written plain across her face, he met her eyes and did not look away first. "Well," Hetty said in the voice of a woman filing a report she intended to deliver in full later. "So you did live then?" "Seems so." He kept his voice even. "Owe that to Miss Vane. Wouldn't be standing here otherwise." He watched something move through the gathered faces at that. Not quite shame. The town was not yet ready for shame, but a small unsettling of certainty. The particular discomfort of people who have arranged a story about a person and are now being asked, politely but firmly, to consider a different draft of it. Beside him, Marta had gone very still, and he understood that stillness too now. It was the shape she made when she was bracing for a blow she had absorbed so many times she no longer flinched visibly at its approach, only inside, where it did not show. He reached over, without entirely planning to, and set his hand briefly at the small of her back. Not a large gesture, not one meant for the street to read too much into, but enough that she would feel it, enough to say, without words, "I see what this costs you, and I am not going anywhere." She did not lean into it. She was not, yet, a woman who leaned into anything in front of an audience. But something in her shoulders eased by a fraction, and when she spoke next to Hetty, her voice had steadied. "Need salt and coffee if you've got it in," she said, "and I'll take that mail if there's any come for the Vane place. Been a while since I checked." It was, on its surface, nothing. An ordinary errand, ordinary words, the ordinary business of a woman restocking her pantry before winter, closed the roads for good. But it was delivered this time with a witness at her shoulder who had refused to be embarrassed by her, and something about that small addition rippled through the gathered crowd in a way none of them could have named. A recalibration too subtle to be called a change of heart, but real enough to be felt. Etta Odell, watching from the store window with the frank, unguarded interest of a child too young to have learned the town's careful choreography, grinned outright at the sight of the two of them standing together, unbothered, in the middle of the street. "Told you," she said to no one, satisfied, and went back to her buttons. Hetty handed over the salt, the coffee, and, after a pause that carried its own small weight, a single letter, its paper heavier and finer than anything that ordinarily found its way to the Vane box, addressed in a careful clerk's hand to Miss Marta Vane, Coldwater Creek Homestead, and bearing, in the corner, the embossed mark of a land office 2 counties distant. Marta took it without looking at it too closely, tucked it into her coat with the salt and the coffee, and did not open it there in the street in front of the town that had only just begun, grudgingly, to stop looking at her sideways. Silas watched her tuck it away and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather, an old, familiar dread he could not yet put a name to, though his instincts, honed by 21 years of watching men in fine coats send letters ahead of trouble, were already telling him, quite clearly, that whatever was folded inside that heavy paper was not going to be good news. He did not say so. Not yet. He only stayed close to her shoulder the whole ride home, watching the letters shape through the fabric of her coat pocket the way another man might watch a coiled snake, and told himself, without much conviction, that he was likely imagining the worst out of habit, and that there was no reason yet to believe the past he had spent 21 years outrunning had somehow found its way onto this particular woman's land before he had thought to warn her it might be coming. He was wrong about that. He would understand exactly how wrong within the week. She did not open the letter that night or the next, and he did not ask her to, though its presence sat in the house with them like a third occupant. Neither of them was willing to acknowledge by name. Instead, for a handful of days, the two of them settled into something that felt, to both of them, dangerously close to peace. The work went on, because the work always went on, but it had softened at its edges into something with room in it for small, unnecessary kindnesses. He took to splitting more kindling than the day required, so she would not have to, in the coldest part of the evening. She took to setting aside the better cuts of what little meat they had for his plate, and the leaner for her own, a fact he noticed and did not comment on, understanding that to name a kindness aloud in this house was often to embarrass the person offering it out of giving it again. He carved, in the evenings, using her father's old knife with her blessing. Clumsy at first, and then less so, and on the 9th night after the letter arrived he set something small and rough-edged on the sill beside her father's wolf, and said nothing about it, and went to bank the fire as though he had not just left a piece of himself sitting in plain view of her whole house. She found it the next morning, a second wolf, cruder than the first, one leg shorter than its match, unmistakably an answer to it rather than a copy. She stood over it a long moment before he came in from the yard, and when he did, she did not thank him, because thanking him would have required naming what the gesture meant, and neither of them were yet brave enough for that. She only said, "Ears are lopsided," in a voice gone thick despite her best effort to keep it light, and he said, "Learned from the finest example available." And something passed between them in that exchange that neither of them had words for yet, and did not need any. There were other firsts, small and unremarkable to anyone but the two of them. The first time she let him drive the cart, instead of taking the reins herself, watching his hands the whole while with an attention she pretended was about the mule's temperament, and was not entirely. The first time he woke before her and had the fire built and the coffee started, and she came out to find it done and stood in the doorway a moment too long before she could make herself say anything at all. The first snow that fell heavy enough to close the road proper, trapping the two of them together in the small warm house for 3 unbroken days, during which the careful distance they had maintained in the weeks prior collapsed, slowly and without either of them announcing it, into something closer. Chairs pulled nearer the fire in the evenings, a hand that found another hand across the narrow table and was not pulled away. He told her, on the second of those snowbound days, more of his past than he had told anyone in 21 years. Not the fire, not yet. He could not yet make himself say the word fire in her hearing, without his voice betraying him entirely. But the shape around it, a family lost young, a life he had walked away from under his own power because staying had felt, at the time, like a kind of dying he did not have the courage to do in the open. He did not give her names. She did not ask for them. She only listened in the particular way she had of listening, without interrupting, without offering easy comfort that would have cheapened what it cost him to say it. And when he finished, she was quiet a long moment and then said only, "Man doesn't run from nothing. Whatever it was enough to run from. That's all I need to know of it, unless you want to tell me the rest." "I will," he said, and meant it, though he did not yet know how soon the deciding would be taken out of his hands entirely. "Just not tonight." "Tonight's fine," she said, and reached over and set another log on the fire, and the subject closed itself gently, the way a door closes when someone trusts it will open again when it's needed to. It was the closest either of them had come, in 6 weeks, to saying the word that neither of them had yet risked speaking aloud. Not love, not exactly, not this early, but its foundation, the slow architecture of 2 guarded people, deciding, brick by careful brick, that the other one was safe to build something on. He watched her in the firelight that night, her face gone soft in a way the town of Silas had never once been permitted to see, and understood, with a certainty that frightened him more than the fire in his memory ever had, that he was no longer merely grateful to this woman for saving his life. He had begun, somewhere in the quiet accumulation of small ordinary days, to love her entirely and without reservation, and the knowledge of it sat inside him alongside the old dread of the letter still unopened on the mantel. 2 truths occupying the same small warm room, one of them a gift, and the other, though neither of them knew it yet, a fuse already lit and burning slow toward everything they had only just begun to build. The letter sat on the mantel through all 3 snowbound days, its heavy paper catching the firelight now and then when the flames guttered high, patient in the particular way that trouble is always patient, because trouble, unlike people, never runs out of time to wait for its moment. She opened the letter on the 4th morning, once the road had cleared enough that its contents could no longer be treated as a hypothetical. She was free to postpone. She read it once at the table, in silence, her face giving away nothing, and then read it a second time, more slowly, and it was only on the second reading that he saw her hands, ordinarily so steady, go tight enough around the paper to crease it. "They're calling the note," she said finally, and her voice had the flat, careful quality of a person keeping herself deliberately calm because the alternative was not calm at all. "Father took a loan against the land, 8 years back, bad winter, lost near half the herd and needed seed money to see us through to spring. I knew of it, didn't know it had changed hands." She smoothed the letter against the table, as though smoothing it might soften what it said. Says here it's been bought up by a land concern out of the territorial capital. Marrow Consolidated Holdings. Says the note comes due whole in 90 days, or they take the land against it. 90 days. He said it quietly, though something cold had already begun moving through him at the name on the page, a name he had not heard spoken aloud in 21 years and had hoped, with the particular hope of a man who has spent 2 decades avoiding a reckoning, never to hear again. Marta. Who signed that letter? What name? She turned it toward him, and he looked down at the clerk's careful hand, the embossed seal, and beneath it, the signature of the agent authorized to act on the holding company's behalf. J. Lund, Esk. The name did not mean anything to her. It meant everything to him. He had last seen it, or one very much like it, on a bill of sale his father had refused to put his own name to 3 days before the fire. A bill of sale for mineral rights under land that had, until that fire, belonged to a family whose name Silas had not spoken aloud since the night he ran from it. He sat down heavily, and Marta, watching the color leave his face entirely, said his name once, sharp with concern, and he did not answer her for a long moment, because he was busy, in that moment, watching 21 years of careful distance collapse all at once into a single, unbearable clarity. I know that name, he said finally. I know what he does with it. He doesn't buy notes because he wants the money, Marta. He's never once wanted the money. He wants what's under the ground, and he collects it by making sure whatever's sitting on top of it can't afford to say no to him. He looked up at her, and the fear in his face was not, she understood immediately, fear for himself. Is there anything on this land, mineral, anything a man like that would want under it? She was quiet a moment, working back through years of half-remembered conversation, her father's occasional mutterings about surveymen who'd come through asking odd questions a decade back and been sent off his porch with nothing for their trouble. There was talk once, copper, maybe, or coal, up past the North Ridge. Father never let anyone dig to find out for certain. Said a man doesn't sell what's under his feet to strangers he's only just met. A cold understanding was dawning in her own face now, mirroring his. You know this man. I knew him 21 years ago. The words came out of him at last, the ones he had been unable to say even in the safety of the snowbound fire. He came to buy mineral rights off my father, and my father told him no the same way yours did. 3 days later, our house burned with my father inside it, and I ran, and I never went back, and I never told a soul who I was after, because I believed, I let myself believe, because it was easier than the alternative, that if I disappeared entirely, stopped being anyone with a claim to anything, he'd have no more reason to come looking. He met her eyes, and the shame in his was old and total. I didn't warn you. I didn't know it was him behind any of this until I saw his name just now, but I should have told you who I was carrying with me the day I came up your road. I let you take in a stranger without telling you the stranger came trailing a man like that behind him. She did not soften toward him immediately, and he did not expect her to. The betrayal, however unintentional, was real, and she needed a moment to sit with it before she could set it down. But when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied into something harder and more certain than fear. You're telling me the man trying to take my father's land killed yours? I'm telling you, I believe it. I've believed it for 21 years and never had the courage to prove it. Then you're going to find that courage now, she said, standing, the old chair scraping back hard against the floor, because I'm not signing away my father's ground to a man who burns houses to get at what's under them, and I am not doing it alone, and neither, Silas, are you." Outside, the wind had picked back up along the ridgeline, carrying with it the particular metallic smell of more weather coming, and somewhere down the long white road toward Silas, a rider none of them had yet seen was already approaching, carrying with him the second half of a scheme 2 decades in the making, and neither the fire in Silas's past nor the debt on Marta's land, they would soon understand, had ever been 2 separate troubles at all. They had only ever been the same hand, closing slowly, patiently, around 2 different pieces of the same ground. The rider arrived at the Vane gate 3 days later, and he came, as men like him always did, with courtesy instead of a gun, which Silas had long since learned was the more dangerous of the 2. Josiah Lund was not a large man, nor a young one, but he carried himself with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted, because he had learned early that paper did the raising for him. He arrived in a good coat, on a good horse, with a leather case of documents strapped behind his saddle, and he tipped his hat to Marta with a warmth so practiced it was nearly convincing, and it was only when his eyes moved past her to the man standing in the doorway behind her that something in his composed face flickered briefly before smoothing back over. "Well," he said, and his voice had the same oiled courtesy Silas remembered from a porch 21 years gone, "I confess I did not expect to find you here, of all the ground in the territory. It's been a long while." "Not long enough," Silas said. "I'd heard rumors over the years. A boy who ran off into a storm and was never found. I confess I'd assumed the mountain had settled the matter for me." Lund's smile did not reach his eyes. "It seems I was premature in that assumption." Marta stepped forward, putting herself deliberately between the 2 men and the conversation both of them clearly wanted to have without her. "You're on my ground, Mr. Lund, and I'll thank you to state your business with me plainly, since it's my note you're holding and not his." "Of course, Miss Vane. Forgive me." Lund's attention returned to her with the same smooth courtesy, though something calculating moved behind it now, a man rapidly revising his plans in light of new information. "I've come to discuss the note in a spirit of neighborly accommodation. 90 days is, I understand, a difficult window for a homestead of your size to meet in full. I'm prepared to offer more generous terms, an extension, favorable interest, even a partial forgiveness of the principal, in exchange for a modest concession. Mineral rights only to the North Ridge parcel. You'd retain the surface, the grazing, the house. I'd simply require the right to survey and extract whatever lies beneath it. And if I say no, then the note comes due as written, and I would be regrettably obligated to collect against the whole of the property." He spread his hands, the picture of reluctant sympathy. "I take no pleasure in that outcome, Miss Vane, but business is business, and a debt is a debt, however it came to change hands." "It came to change hands," Silas said low, "the same way my families did. You bought up the note quiet, through men whose names don't touch yours directly, and you'll wait exactly as long as it takes for her to refuse you, and then you'll find a reason the land needs clearing anyway. That's how it went last time. I watched it happen from a tree line with my own eyes." Something in Lund's face went very still, the practiced warmth dropping away for just a moment to show the flat calculation underneath it. "That is a serious accusation, coming from a man with no name to put behind it, and no proof beyond a boy's 20-year-old memory of a night he was, by his own account, too frightened to see clearly. I saw enough. You saw a fire in the dark and 3 shapes you couldn't name then and can't name now. Lund's voice had cooled by several careful degrees. I'd think twice before repeating that story anywhere it might be heard by someone with the standing to ask you to prove it in a court of law. Men have been hanged for slander with less at stake than a land concern's good name. The threat sat in the cold air between them, unmistakable despite its courteous delivery, and Marta, watching it land, felt something in her chest go hard and clear and entirely without fear. "You'll get off my ground now, Mr. Lund," she said, "and you'll take your 90 days and your generous terms with you, because I would rather lose every acre my father left me than sign one line of it over to a man who burns families out of their homes to clear his path to what's underneath them. And you should know, before you ride off so pleased with yourself, that I intend to spend every one of those 90 days finding whatever proof this man was too frightened to look for alone, and this time he won't be looking for it alone." Lund studied the two of them a long moment, and whatever calculation moved behind his composed face resolved, finally, into something colder and more decided than before. "As you wish, Miss Vane. 90 days. He gathered his reins and paused, looking once more at Silas with an expression that carried, for the first time, something almost like genuine reassessment. "I'll admit, I'm curious what name you're going by these days. It would be a shame, given how thoroughly you've been presumed dead all this time, if reappearing now were to prove inconvenient for your continued good health." He rode off unhurried, the way he had arrived, and the two of them stood watching him go down the long white road until he was only a small dark shape against the snow, and then nothing at all. "He'll come at us sideways now," Silas said quietly, once the sound of hooves had faded entirely. "Men like him don't lose an argument in the open. They wait, and then something happens that no one can trace back to their door. Then we don't wait for it to find us," Marta said. "We go looking first." Neither of them yet knew how little time that decision would buy them, or how close the shadow already circling their small warm house had come to closing in entirely. But that night, for the first time since the letter had arrived, they sat together at the table with her father's ledger of debts and his own fractured memory of a fire, and began, side by side, to build a case against a man who had spent 21 years believing no one was left alive who would ever dare to bring one. The proof, when it finally surfaced, did not come from grand effort, but from patient accumulation, the way most true things do. Ansel Pruitt asked quietly whether he remembered any survey men passing through the territory 2 decades back, remembered more than expected. A name in a hotel ledger in the county seat. A land agent who had stopped at his father's place asking about mineral claims the same season a family 2 valleys over had lost their house, and everyone assumed at the time its people. To an accidental fire no one had ever properly investigated because there had been no one left alive, it was believed, to ask the questions. Hetty Odell, once she understood what was being asked and why, proved unexpectedly useful. Her decades of careful attention to every scrap of gossip passing through Silas amounting, it turned out, to something very close to a historical record. She remembered the name Marrow. She remembered, with some digging through an old account book she'd kept out of habit rather than necessity, that a Marrow claim 2 counties over had been quietly absorbed into a larger holding company's portfolio within a year of the family's disappearance. sold off by a court-appointed administrator who had never been able to locate any surviving heirs to object. It was Silas himself, in the end, who provided the piece that turned scattered rumor into something closer to evidence. A name, finally spoken aloud after 21 years of silence, his own name, the whole of it, offered first to Marta alone by the fire one night, and then, 2 days later, to Judge Elias Pruitt, the circuit judge who rode through Silas once a season to hear what disputes had accumulated since his last visit. "Silas Marrow," he said, standing in the small back room of the chapel that served the judge as a temporary courtroom, and the saying of it out loud after 2 decades of carrying only half a name felt to him like setting down something he had not realized until the weight left his shoulders, how heavy it had grown. The son of Thomas Marrow, who died the night his house burned 21 years past, refusing to sell mineral rights to a man who came calling with a courteous smile and a bill of sale already drawn up in advance of any agreement. Judge Pruitt, a weathered man well past 60 who had seen enough territorial land disputes in his career to have developed a healthy and well-earned suspicion of any transaction too convenient to be coincidence, listened to the whole of it without interruption. The fire, the tracks, the latched shed door no one had ever explained, the note on Marta's land bought up quiet by the same company that had absorbed the Marrow claim 2 decades before. The mineral survey requested on both properties within the same narrow season. That is a great many coincidences to ask a court to overlook, Mr. Marrow, the judge said finally, and not near enough proof, on its own, to hang a man for murder 2 decades gone cold. But it is more than enough to call a public hearing on the matter of these notes, and to ask Mr. Lund to account, in front of witnesses, for the provenance of both. The hearing was set for the following week in the chapel whose bell was too big for its steeple, and word of it moved through Silas faster than the storm that had first brought Silas up the Vane Road, and by the morning it convened. The little building was fuller than it had been for any wedding or funeral in Hetty Odell's considerable memory. Lund arrived composed, as he always did, in a good coat with a leather case of documents that he clearly believed would settle the matter cleanly in his favor. And for the first quarter hour of the proceedings it seemed as though he might be right. He spoke smoothly of legitimate purchase, of notes changing hands through entirely ordinary channels of commerce, of an old fire that had been thoroughly investigated at the time and ruled misfortune, and of a boy's fevered memory, 2 decades distant, being asked to stand as evidence against a respected businessman's good name. It was Marta who broke the smoothness of it, standing when Judge Pruitt called for any further testimony, her full height filling the small chapel in a way that made even Lund's composure falter for the first time that morning. "I've got something the court hasn't seen yet," she said, and produced from beneath her coat the heavy folder she and Silas had assembled over 3 long weeks of quiet, careful work. Ansel's hotel ledger entry, Hetty's old account book, and, most damning of all, a letter she had found folded inside her own father's private papers, written to him 8 years past by a survey agent whose name matched, precisely, one of the same lesser names Lund had used to quietly buy up the Marrow note 2 decades before, offering, in language nearly identical to the offer made at her own gate, generous terms in exchange for mineral rights, and warning, with the same oiled courtesy, of unfortunate consequences should he refuse. "My father refused him too," Marta said into a chapel gone entirely silent. "He never told me why he kept this letter instead of burning it. I expect he wanted somebody, someday, to be able to prove what kind of man had come asking." She looked directly at Lund as she said it and did not look away. Turns out that day is today. Lund's composure did not shatter all at once. It cracked, instead, the way ice cracks on a pond too long trusted to hold weight it was never built for. A hairline first, in the set of his jaw, and then, as Judge Pruitt began reading the documents aloud into the record one by one, in the slow spreading whiteness of his face as he understood, watching the town's collective attention turn toward him with a weight it had never once, in 2 decades of careful courtesy, been made to bear. "This is circumstantial," he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness, gone thin and quick in a way that told the chapel more than his words did. A letter, an old ledger entry, a grown man's memory of a night he was 8 years old. "It is circumstantial," Judge Pruitt agreed, mild as ever, "which is precisely why I intend to send a formal inquiry to the territorial capital requesting the full transaction record of Merrow Consolidated Holdings, cross-referenced against every note it has acquired in this county for the past 2 decades, and I expect, Mr. Lund, that a man with nothing to hide would welcome that inquiry rather than object to it." The silence that followed was total, and in it Josiah Lund understood, along with everyone else crowded into that small chapel, that whatever careful architecture he had spent 20 years building on the quiet ruin of other people's grief had just, in the space of a single morning, begun to come down around him. The territorial inquiry took the better part of a month to return, and it returned, when it finally did, with more than even Judge Pruitt had anticipated. A pattern stretching back nearly 15 years, a dozen notes quietly acquired across 3 counties, each of them tied to land that had, within a season of the acquisition, revealed some mineral or timber value nobody had bothered to investigate until the paperwork was already settled, and at least 3 of those transactions shadowed, in the record, by fires or sudden disappearances that had never been properly examined at the time they occurred. Josiah Lund did not wait for the marshal's men to arrive at his office in the territorial capital. He was gone within the week, his accounts hastily liquidated, his good coat and his leather case of documents vanished along with him into whatever corner of the territory or beyond it a man runs to when the smooth machinery he has spent 2 decades building finally seizes and stops. He was not caught that season, nor, so far as anyone in Silas ever learned, the season after. But the company that had carried his name into 2 counties' worth of quiet ruin did not survive his disappearance. Its remaining assets were seized, and its outstanding notes, including the one bearing Marta Vane's name, and the older, deeper one bearing the ghost of the Merrow claim, were voided by court order within the month, on the finding that both had been acquired through fraud. It was not, in the end, a tidy justice. The men who had ridden up to a burning porch 21 years ago were never named, never found, and the fire that had taken Silas's father remained, officially, an unsolved matter, a scar on the record that would never fully close the way a scar on a body sometimes does. Silas grieved that incompleteness quietly in the weeks after the hearing, sitting some evenings with the ledger of his father's old claim spread open on the table, tracing the boundaries of land he now had every legal right to reclaim and found, when he tried to imagine actually doing so, that he did not want it. Not the acreage, not the mineral wealth underneath it that had cost his father his life to protect. None of it. He signed it over, in the end, to the Territorial Land Office for public use, keeping for himself nothing but the single carved wolf that had survived the fire in his pocket, and the second, cruder one that now sat beside it on Marta's sill. Silas, for its part, did what small towns do slowly and imperfectly when they are forced to confront the gap between the story they told themselves about a person and the truth of who that person actually was. There was no grand ceremony of apology. Towns rarely offer those, and the ones that do rarely mean them fully. But Hetty Odell began setting aside the good coffee for Marta's visits instead of the ordinary stock, and did not charge her full price for it, and called it, when pressed, simply neighborly. And Marta, for the first time in 11 years, let herself accept the kindness without suspecting it of hiding an insult underneath. Old Ansel began leaving eggs on the porch again, the way he had when her father was alive, and the Vane place had not yet learned to expect the town's careful distance, and Etta Odell took to walking the last stretch of road out to the homestead some afternoons after her chores, entirely unbothered by the size of the woman she'd come to visit, asking Marta to teach her to split kindlin' the way a giant does, which made Marta laugh outright, a sound the girl clearly intended to hear as often as she could manage to earn it. Judge Pruitt, riding through on his final circuit of the season, stopped at the Vane gate long enough to deliver, along with the final voided notes, a piece of unsolicited but not unwelcome commentary. Man doesn't often get to watch a wrong 2 decades old get set right in the space of a single season, he said, tipping his hat to them both from horseback. I'd call that a fortunate turn, for a story that started as poorly as I understand yours did. Wasn't luck, Marta said, standing on her own porch with Silas a half step behind her shoulder, close enough that the judge could see, without either of them saying so, exactly how matters stood between them now. Was just 2 people who'd both been counted out deciding not to stay counted out. The judge, who had seen a great deal in his years riding circuit through hard country, allowed that this was likely nearer the truth of it than luck, and rode on and left the 2 of them alone on the porch in the thin gold light of a season. Finally, after so much winter, beginning to turn. Spring came slower than expected that year, the way it often does at that elevation, the Bittern Range holding on to its snow well past the point the lower valleys had gone green, as though the mountain itself were in no particular hurry to let go of winter's certainties. But it came in the end, the way it always did, the creek breaking loose from its ice with a sound like something enormous exhaling, the first thin grass pushing up green and stubborn through ground that had been frozen solid for 6 long months, and Marta wrote the date of it, as she always did, into the small soft-covered ledger her father and his father before him had kept. 3 generations of Vanes measuring their lives against a mountain that did not know it was being measured, except that this year, for the first time in 11, she was not the only hand recording it. Silas had taken up a ledger of his own by then, smaller, newer, its pages not yet softened by years of handling, in which he had begun, slowly and without any particular plan for what it would become, to write down the things he no longer wanted to forget. His father's name. The shape of the fire, finally, fully, the whole of it committed to paper rather than carried silent behind his ribs, because a thing written down, he had discovered, no longer needed to be guarded quite so closely against the dark. And other things, too. Smaller, newer things. The date Marta had first sat on the porch step beside her father's empty chair instead of leaving him to occupy it alone. The recipe for the broth she'd fed him in his fever, which he had asked her, eventually, to teach him properly. The morning, 3 weeks after the hearing closed and Lund's shadow had finally, fully lifted from both their lives, that she had taken his hand across the breakfast table without being asked, and simply held it, without ceremony, the way she did most things that mattered to her. They did not marry with any great fuss in the end, though the whole of Silas turned out for it anyway, crowding the little chapel whose bell was too big for its steeple, far past its ordinary capacity, Hetty Odell weeping openly and unashamedly through the entire brief ceremony, Etta serving as the smallest and most delighted witness the county had likely ever produced. Ansel standing at the back with his hat in his hands and an expression of quiet, weathered satisfaction that needed no further comment. Judge Pruitt, passing through on a circuit that happened, by fortunate coincidence or careful arrangement, to align with the date, performed the ceremony himself, and remarked afterward, to no one in particular, that he had married a great many couples in his years riding this territory, and had rarely seen two people stand quite so plainly, unapologetically, entirely themselves in front of a crowd that had once found reasons to look away from each of them separately. That evening, with the chapel emptied and the town's celebration wound down into the particular contented quiet that follows a good long day, the two of them walked back out to the Coldwater homestead together in the last long light, the sky doing the thing it did at that hour in that country, cycling slow through purple and deep orange into a blue, so dark it was nearly black at its edges. The whole enormous sweep of it laid out over land that had, for 3 generations, asked nothing of the people who worked it except honesty and endurance, and had, at last, after so much winter, been given both in equal measure. They stood a while on the porch together before going in, her father's chair between them, neither one of them sitting in it, because it had become, without either of them deciding so out loud, a place reserved not for absence any more but for memory, a chair that held the shape of everyone who had loved this ground before them and would someday hold the shape of whoever came after. "Town's different toward you now," Silas said, watching the last color drain slow out of the western sky. "Different toward us both." "Some," Marta agreed. "Not all the way, and maybe never all the way. Folks don't unlearn 11 years of looking past somebody in a single season, no matter how sorry they end up feeling about it after." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of hard-won peace. "Doesn't matter near as much as it used to, though. Being looked at was never the thing I was missing. Was being seen, and I've got that now, whatever the rest of them decide to do about it." He reached over and took her hand, the way she had once taken his without asking, and the 2 carved wolves sat side by side on the sill behind them in the last of the light, one worn smooth by 21 years of a frightened boy's thumb, the other rough and new and made entirely for her, and, between the two of them, on the porch of a house that had weathered fire and debt and 2 decades of a town's careless judgment and come through the other side of all of it still standing, still theirs. The quiet settled in at last. Not the wide, empty quiet either of them had once mistaken for peace, but something fuller than that, something earned. "Not every ending needs to be tidy," Marta had said once, back when the hearing was still uncertain and the outcome still unclear, to still be an ending. This one was not entirely tidy. The men who had set the first fire were never found. The mountain kept its old secrets the way mountains always do, and somewhere out beyond the territory's edge, a man in a good coat was still, presumably, running from a reckoning that had not yet fully caught him. But on the porch at Coldwater Creek, in the last light of a spring evening, 2 people had once believed, separately, they would never get to see arrive together. None of that unfinished business weighed as heavy as the plain, sturdy fact of 2 hands joined on a railing that had waited a long time for someone worth holding on to, and a mountain standing patient and unhurried in the dark beyond them, keeping its long, silent watch over a ground that had, at last, after so many hard seasons, come fully and quietly home to itself.